I wanted to share some thoughts about Andrew Huberman's recent podcast on skin health and sunlight. Now, Andrew did a really good job initially in discussing the basic physiology of the skin and the anatomy. I think that was very informative. There's a couple of points that I think were incomplete and perhaps lacking. I think the discussion around sunscreen is incomplete until we take into account a concept which I've called skin type latitude mismatch. It's a pretty simple concept, and I'll explain it to you briefly. Essentially, it is the difference between the amount of melanin that we have in our epidermis, in our skin, naturally as a genetic endowment, and the environment that we're currently living in. Is the amount of melanin that we have congruent with the UV conditions of our ancestors, or is it different? This is important because today a lot of people live in an area that their ancestors did not grow up and did not evolve. So if you are a native Swedish living in Sweden, there's no mismatch, and you have the exact right amount of melanin in your skin for the ambient UV conditions of that area. But the problem becomes if you are too pale for the amount of UV light in the area that you live. And for example, someone of Northern European descent living in Australia. And to understand this really, obviously, is to simply compare the skin type of someone who has that Northern European ancestry with someone who is an Indigenous Australian. And there's obviously a massive difference in the amount of epidermal melanin to deal with the huge UV yield in Australia. So that is a mismatch. That's one type of mismatch. But the other type of mismatch is when people of equatorial origin or very, very dark Fitzpatrick skin type 5 or 6 end up moving to a northern or higher latitude. And this is a different type of mismatch, but it essentially can be even more difficult to mitigate because there's not enough UV light in the environment to deal with, to just simply generate enough vitamin D for optimal health. The issue about the use of sunscreen comes down really to people who are living in an area of UV yield higher than that of their ancestors. Because if you are matched, then really cultivating your natural skin pigmentation and homeostatic mechanisms of UV defense through melanin and a range of other natural mechanisms should be sufficient to prevent the need or preclude the need for using chemical sunscreens or at all. So is the case as if you're mismatched, because there's obviously no point in putting additional UVB protection on if you are simply not able to burn or generate enough vitamin D in the ambient UV conditions. So the whole discussion about sunscreens essentially comes down to people who are living in an area of higher UV yield than their ancestors. And I won't go into it in depth in this video, but the mitigating factor here is, or the ability to mitigate is simply shade, and that essentially avoids the disruptions in cutaneous circadian non-visual photoreception, POMC signaling that occur when we end up blocking the natural full spectrum sunlight spectrum to our eyes and skin. The second point that I really want to emphasize that I disagreed with or I thought was incomplete was Andrew's discussion on all-cause mortality and its role in sunlight, because this is really the main show. All-cause mortality and sun exposure is the main show, and in my opinion, photoaging is behind that. That is a secondary consideration. So any advice to get more or less sunlight has to first, in my opinion, and in others like Professor Richard Weller's opinion, should consider all-cause mortality. So Professor Huberman mentioned a key paper called Avoidance of Sun Exposure and a Competing Risk Analysis and All-Cause Mortality. It's a paper by Pelle Lindqvist and al., and it's an analysis of the melanoma in southern Sweden cohort, which was essentially 30,000 women followed over a period of more than 25 years. And they collected at baseline and at every 10 years data, self-reported data about sunlight exposure habits. What they were able to do is they were able to plot a mortality or lifespan against those sun-seeking behavior habits, and found that sun avoidance, or the women who answered no to 4 questions about sun-seeking behavior, they had the highest mortality. So Andrew raised this paper in his episode, but really didn't really go in depth enough into it, and essentially suggested that the findings, which were significant enough to be equivalent in magnitude to smoking avoidance, sun avoidance was equivalent to smoking in its effect on mortality. And Andrew didn't really go into depth enough to mention that this paper showed a dose response, meaning that those with the lowest sun exposure had the greatest mortality, and then the intermediate had slightly more mortality, and those with the greatest sun-seeking behaviors had the most mortality. So there was a clear dose response. And when we discuss association and causation, we use a criteria called the Bradford-Hill criteria, and dose response is a key factor in determining whether this is merely an associational relationship or it's a causal relationship. The other factors that really need to be made is that this is not the first study that has shown an all-cause mortality benefit or a reduction in mortality with greater UV light exposure. And we can go back to the 1930s with Peller and Stevenson, who looked at US Navy sailors and saw that they had a higher rate of skin cancer, SCC, and potentially melanoma, but their all-cause mortality was lower, and they died less, and they had less non-cutaneous cancers. The more studies that have really confirmed this, and again that Professor Huberman didn't mention, was that the analysis of the UK Biobank, this huge 300-person cohort in the UK, was done by Richard Weller and a range of other UK researchers, and they found the exact same thing, which was there was a dose, there was a latitude-related reduction in all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and cancer mortality the further south in the UK you lived, and the more sun-seeking behavior you had. So really, I would have liked to see that topic elucidated more. And circling back to the beginning of this video, is I don't think we can have a coherent discussion about the sun risks and benefits without first addressing all-cause mortality. That is the first topic. And later on, we can talk about photoaging. And yes, photoaging is a potential consequence of increasing UV light exposure, which I believe can be mitigated to a very large degree with long wavelength red and infrared gotten from morning sun, and potentially supplemented through photobiomodulation devices. But if you ask a group of dermatologists whose main domain is skin cancer and photoaging, if you ask them these questions, they're going to give you those type of answers. And it actually needs a more wide analysis. And I'll end this video with a quote from Professor Richard Weller, who is, I believe, the only dermatologist that I'm aware of discussing all-cause mortality. And he said, it is the duty of physicians to occupy ourselves with matters of all-cause mortality and not the narrow prevention of skin cancer. So hopefully Dr. Huberman can do another episode where he goes in depth into the literature around all-cause mortality and sunlight, and we know that mechanistically there are so many pathways that could account for this. So I hope this gives you some context, and I really encourage you to listen to the first part of that Huberman Lab episode, and yeah, consider some of the things that I've raised. Thanks.